Thank you for joining me today for Champaign-Urbana Jewish Federation's Holocaust Education Center podcast series. I am joined today by Dr. Gene Robinson, the director of the Carl R Woese Institute for Genomic Biology. He holds a Swanlund Chair at the University of Illinois, and he's a professor of entomology. Sadly, he is also the son of two survivors of the Holocaust. Thank you so much for joining me today, Gene.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm glad to be here today.
Before we get into your family's history, I want to hear more about you. I've known you for a long time, but I knew nothing about your history of where you grew up and what led you to this community. Can you back up and tell me a little bit about yourself?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I grew up in Buffalo, New York, and after a chance exposure to honeybees, which I'm glad to embellish in a moment, but after that chance exposure, I ended up going to school at Cornell University, where I received all three of my degrees, Cornell in upstate New York, not far from Buffalo. Then I started moving westward, and now together with my wife of 42 years, Julia, we moved to Ohio State University, where I took a postdoc and then started looking for a permanent job on a faculty at a university. And one of the jobs that came open was here at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Both Julia and I grew up on the East Coast. We didn't know much about the Midwest, but the entomology department at the University of Illinois was renowned. It's always been in the top 2 or 3 in the country for decades. That was attractive. It all worked out, and I got the job, and we moved. And like many Easterners transplanted to the Midwest, especially a small town in the Midwest, we thought we'd be here for a few years and then get back to civilization on the East Coast. But this place grew on us. It was a fantastic place for my career and a wonderful and warm city to raise a family. We fell in love with the vibrant Jewish community, and here we are.
You mentioned a chance encounter with bees. Most people who become entomologists, they started their fascination as young children and it just grew in adulthood. Can you tell me about your, quote, chance encounter?
You're exactly right. Many entomologists grow up as kids collecting bugs, loving bugs, having them in the house in all different forms of containers, driving their families crazy. I was not one of those kids. I was not particularly interested in insects or even biology at all. What happened was my freshman year in college was the October War, 1973. And so I took time off from my studies to volunteer to be on a kibbutz. And on the kibbutz, I was asked one day after spending a few months there if I would just help out with the bees for a couple of days because someone was sick and the beekeeper needed some help. And that was it. I was smitten by bees in a figurative sense and said I wanted to work with them for the rest of my life. My parents were shocked and wondering what was going on. No doctor, no lawyer. Where did we go wrong? But they recovered, and my mother started a fairly strong, relentless campaign saying, well, if you found what you love to do, get a PhD in it. She helped guide me to Cornell University, which was very well known for studies of entomology and honeybees, and that was how I got on that path.
And nothing you just said surprises me. You leaving school to go volunteer on a kibbutz, you helping somebody with the bees, that's just who you are. You just referenced your parents, Sonya and Jack Robinson. They escaped the atrocities of the Nazis, but theirs was a different path to safety. Let's get into their story. Your mother was born in Leningrad, Russia. She moved to Berlin, Germany. Would you say she had a pretty comfortable childhood, but then she had to flee to Prague, Czechoslovakia? So can you tell me about your mom's childhood and what led up to them having to flee from the Nazis?
Yeah, certainly. She grew up in Leningrad, spent her first 7 years living there, and then things got a little difficult. Her family was affluent and owned a pharmaceutical company, so things were a little difficult after the Bolshevik Revolution. They left, essentially escaped Russia for Germany and had to transfer whatever wealth they could into whatever you could carry. She had stories of having jewels hidden on her, and as they crossed the border, having to pretend to be asleep at age 7. And so quite a harrowing experience. But then they did make a life in Berlin. They got settled, and my mother was being trained to be a concert pianist. And that was a really important part of her upbringing. Things then got very tense in Germany with the rise of Hitler. There was then a move under duress to Czechoslovakia, which was short-lived until the Nazis took over Czechoslovakia and things got bad. At that point, he was a young adult and was able to secure passage on a Kindertransport as a youth leader. She was one of the counselors on the Kindertransport. That, of course, is the famous set of transports that Sir Nicholas Winton organized to save many children from that part of Europe ahead of the Nazis. The ships went to the UK. You needed a sponsor to be able to qualify for those ships. And the sponsors were a family, a close family that my mother had in the UK, which is the family of our own cousin who's right here. I'm sure you know Tony Soskin is the son of my mother's first cousin. And it was that family that took her in, and she completed some of her education there before being reunited with her parents. They were able to make it out, although when she said goodbye to them on boarding the Kindertransport, it wasn't clear she would see them again, but they did make it out. They reunited in the UK. Then they made their way to America in 1939. Things were getting pretty bad. The ship was blacked out on the seas to prevent attack, to prevent being located for attack, and made it to the US.
When she told you that story, do you remember how old you were so that you could understand what her family endured?
The story came out a little bit at a time. It wasn't any one time. And in fact, the level of detail that I have now is thanks to my sister Sally, who did a thesis when she was in undergraduate on the history of both of our parents. And so as an adult, she interviewed them and really got the story out of them. Growing up, we heard a little bit. We certainly knew our roots. Holocaust Remembrance Day was an important event. It was a can't miss event for us. And a lot of what we heard over the years growing up was influenced by their experience, and they referenced their experience, education being very important, education being something they can't take away from you.
Nothing else really matters, but just go out there and learn everything you can. Would you say that was the number one lesson she imparted on you?
That one and resilience, how you have to take it as it comes and then respond and move forward. And both parents actually lived that beautifully, really amazing examples of that.
Let's talk about your father now, Jack Robinson. He was born in Poland. With his parents and siblings, he had to move again when the Nazis started closing in on the region. They fled to the Soviet Union. The Nazis arrived there too. Talk about their, quote, chaotic train ride, refugee camp, and eventually labor camp. Your father went through it all, and I know this is hard to retell, so I appreciate you retelling his story.
He was born in Vilna. They moved to Latvia, Riga in particular. And then when things got bad there, they boarded a train where they didn't know where it was going. They just knew that the Nazis were advancing. It was a cattle car train. They were crammed in. People were giving up babies along the way because they had heard what was going to be happening. They were on the train for several days, and then it just stopped. And it stopped in Kazakhstan. There was a makeshift camp there for these refugees. And he and his family spent the war living in really terrible conditions, with the two main activities being actively hiding from conscription into the Red Army, which was basically a death sentence. And they were throwing waves of conscripts at the Nazis. And then trading food coupons to be able to get a little bit more of a balanced diet, but it was pretty meager. Conditions were difficult. His teeth all fell out from malnutrition. One sister died of malnutrition and pneumonia. There were originally 4 children, and one sister, Zhenya, who I'm named after, died. And then a brother also was lost at that time. He was working underground as a Zionist, and then he was arrested. His name is Izya. I'm also named after him. He was sent to a labor camp in Siberia. So those 2 were lost, but my father and his other sister and 2 parents remained. They were in the camp in Kazakhstan. And then after the war liberation, they were moved first to a Red Cross camp in Vienna for about a year, and then moved to a displaced person camp in Paris, where they remained for a couple of years. My father had an uncle who was running a yeshiva in Chicago, and they were able to arrange for him to get out. There was very stiff quotas at the time for Jews post-war, but he was able to get on a yeshiva-related visa. Even though if you ever met my father, he had many qualities, but being destined to be a yeshiva bocher was not one of them, let's say. He lasted a couple of weeks, enough time to make it out, and then made his way. His goal was to earn enough money to be able to bring his parents and sister over from Paris. The yeshiva was in Chicago. And so he was first in Chicago on Maxwell Street selling rags, but then a relative got him to New York and he continued his efforts there, which were ultimately successful. He was able to bring his parents and his sister over to New York.
So he continued a very close relationship with his surviving sister and his parents for the rest of his life. They moved as a unit.
Yeah, very close relationship. They came over pretty late. So this was like 1948, 1949, after the war by the time they were resettled. But yes, that was a very, very close family. His sister saved him once from conscription. He was arrested. She was able to get him released. Yeah, they were a very close family.
Did you ever notice habits in your father that you have to imagine were continued PTSD from what he went through? Eating habits, sleeping habits, things that ingrained themselves in him and that never quite left?
I would say both my parents were remarkably well adjusted and able to move past the horrific events that they experienced, with two exceptions. Whenever there was a siren, they were really tense. And then, as I mentioned, we grew up in Buffalo, very close to Niagara Falls. We would go up to Niagara Falls often. There was an amusement park that my sisters and I really loved. So we would go there, or whenever there was relatives, family visiting, we would go there. And shortly before we would get to the border, they would tense up. Where are the papers? Do you have the papers? Naturalization papers. That was always just, I thought you have the papers. No, you were supposed to have the papers. Just really uncharacteristically tense before getting to the border every time.
Can we back up for a second and can you tell me how the two of them met?
Yeah, they met on a blind date in New York City. I guess a distant relative of both of them. Back then, those kinds of things were pretty common. Set them up and they went out, and that was how they got together.
My question now has to do with your scientific roots, Jean. I'm going to have to quote this study. A 2015 study found the children of survivors of the Holocaust had epigenetic changes to a gene linked to their levels of cortisol, the hormone in stress response. As a scientist, do you feel this personally? Did you notice this in your sisters and yourself?
I'm familiar with that study, and I must say, no, the three of us are very similar to our parents in the sense of a sense of resilience. And so I think we inherited those resilience genes rather than the epigenetic modifications. That's the best I can tell. Maybe there's something lurking deeper. Some say that I'm kind of a workaholic, so maybe there's some connection there, but I can't see otherwise.
You mentioned your father couldn't wait to leave yeshiva. How would you describe your parents' relationship to God and spiritually in their Judaism from leaving to the United States?
Yeah, so Judaism was very important to both of them. My father was raised in a more Orthodox, traditional kind of shtetl environment. My mother, more affluent, Reform, German Jewish background. But Judaism was very important to them. When they moved from New York City shortly after getting married to Buffalo, New York, they immediately joined a temple and became part of the community, and then became very active in the new Hebrew day school that was just opening up. I was the second child enrolled in that day school, and they were very active in the school. It was a tiny school, and my mother was the transportation chairman of the school in the first few years. And my father was the transport in the first few years with a large station wagon. He would take us on field trips. the school. Grew up over the years, all three of us, my two sisters, were attending that school. So they were very plugged into the Jewish community all along.
It sounds like your family was very open in what your parents endured during the war. Is there something your sister found out that surprised her and that surprised you as well that you had not heard?
I don't think, Elizabeth, we knew all those details that I recounted. They're now kind of blurred in my mind as to where I learned them from. We knew the basics of the stories, but my mother getting on the ship, Kindertransport, and not seeing her parents, not knowing if she would see her parents, I don't think she emphasized that when she told that story. The losses that my father endured, we didn't hear that in such graphic detail. So the suffering, I think, and the trauma, I think, were partially left out until Sally was able to get their full stories. And, it was a generational thing. They didn't talk about it often. They certainly made it clear it was a priority for them to make sure we knew our roots. And they did make that clear, but they didn't really want to dwell on the story. And it wasn't until much later, as they felt that they were getting on and that it was important to share their story, that they did.
When they arrived in the United States, did they ever tell you about any anti Semitism they experienced here?
No, they didn't really talk about any anti-Semitism. I think it was just always so much better here than there that that was their point of comparison.
What about you? Have you or your children ever experienced it here in America?
I experienced mild anti-Semitism, some taunting, some slurs, ethnic slurs, when I was sort of between 10, 13 years old, middle school age, around there. But that was the extent of it.
If your parents could tell youth of today who seem to be going down a path of being anti Semitic or as a bully, what do you suppose that your parents would tell a young person that needed a little bit of guidance from somebody who had been through a lot?
I think they would be very concerned about the state of affairs right now, and certainly both witnessed how the rise of anti Semitism, starting off first with derogatory comments and then restrictions, could lead into the unspeakable, horrific tragedies that we associate with the Holocaust and everything related to that. So they were always on guard about that, and I think would definitely be very concerned about the atmosphere that currently exists.
Last question before I let you go. You mentioned your mother was a concert pianist. That was important to her to be musical. You have a beautiful singing voice. You're very musical and very involved in the temple and the services. What other characteristics would you say that you picked up from your mother? And can you name one or two that you also have observed in yourself that you achieved or absorbed from your father?
Yeah, so the musicality was on both sides. My father descended from the Vilna Gaon, who was a renowned scholar, but also a cantor. And his mother, our grandmother, let us know that often and sang with us when we were young children. My mother insisted that we start piano lessons at the age of 5. And so we did. In fact, I had quite a battle with her when I discovered guitar one Sunday night on Ed Sullivan when the Beatles were on when I was 9 years old. It took some time to negotiate a transfer from piano to guitar, but she did relent. And I've been able to enjoy that from her as a legacy. Both my sisters, Liz of blessed memory and Sally, were professional musicians in the DC area. And so we've had a lot of music in the family. The importance of education and transmitting Jewish values was really something that we all absorbed and continued in our own life as parents, raising our children. And then I guess also with respect to my mother, a kind of attitude that if you need to try to do something, you should figure out how to do it and not take no as an answer. She was able to get passage on the ship to America by hounding the US Embassy in London and attempting to speak directly with the ambassador, who at the time was Joseph Kennedy, and was finally intercepted by an assistant as she was attempting to get in the office. And the assistant heard her story and did make it happen. So we've kind of inherited that, especially from her and from my father, a kind of an easygoing attitude that we in the family call the howdy doody genes. To move things forward, to move forward. Kadima, a Hebrew word for moving forward. That was a word that he used a lot.
Thank you for listening today to the Champaign-Urbana Jewish Federation Holocaust Education podcast series. Gene Robinson, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for doing this, Elizabeth, for the community. Very much appreciated.